News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali on TV1.
Hello, good evening and a warm welcome to Newsline. My guest this evening is the COO of the Advocata Institute, Mr. Dhananath Fernando. Very good evening to Dhananath and welcome again to Newsline.
Good evening, Faraz. Thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure as always. Now then, Advocata, of course, it's all about the economy and keeping tabs on how we're doing and so on. So, how are we doing? Has Sri Lanka confirmed and come to an arrangement with all our international sovereign bond holders?
Not at the moment for us. So, we are all expecting to come for some level of agreement with the international creditors. As we all know, there are multiple categories of international creditors, mainly the multilateral donors, bilateral creditors, and the private creditors or the private bondholders. So at the moment we have completed the domestic debt restructuring. When it comes to the international or like the dollar debt restructuring, we are yet to move forward with the process, and that's also quite a challenging period for any debt restructuring, especially when we are negotiating with the dollar debt, because of course one side is the geopolitical reasons where China is not a member of the Paris Club, and in the Paris Club we have agreed to provide equal treatment for all our creditors. So not sure how China will see that. Of course they have provided a commitment to the IMF that they will participate in the debt restructuring process, but what we have seen in other countries, sometimes it can delay, like the countries in Zambia and some countries in other parts of the world. So hopefully, we'll hopefully be able to see some progress by end of this year is my expectation.
And how does this augur for Sri Lanka's economy when the IMF have given us a couple of tranches? Yes, but how are we doing? How much of their requirements have we met in percentage terms at least?
We have to wait for the IMF press conference for us and basically for their board approval to really understand how we have done it so far, and also if there are revisions in the initial agreements or the deadlines, the benchmarks, we have to wait. But as we all know, Verity Research has done an analysis with 100 indicators. So far we have mainly completed about I think 35%, a lot to be done, and we have failed to do about I think another 17%. The challenge is, of course, the rest of it we have some time, but to complete those with that 4-year time frame, most of the reforms has to start now, because even to complete in after 4 years time, so that challenge is there. So most likely IMF will take, if they have completed the missionary their mission, so then they will take it to the board. If they haven't completed their mission, so then most likely they will take few more weeks and conduct probably online discussions or some other arrangement and finish it, and then go to the board and decide what sort of negotiation that we need to do. But I think all depends on also the external debt restructuring, and this tranche is quite critical, because ultimately it is rather than not the IMF 300 or 330 million dollars which is important, but it is the debt restructuring process that is important for us to move forward.
And would you say that the domestic debt has been completely now watertight done? Is it done and dusted?
From what we hear, it is done and dusted for us. Unless we go for another debt restructuring in another cycle, I think it is pretty much done, and now we can move forward for the dollar debt restructuring or the international creditor restructuring or debt restructuring.
And there is some concern, or coming out of Washington and so on, that the Sri Lankan government must make sure that along with this IMF help, that the Sri Lankan government must ensure that their policies do not cause even greater hardship to the people in terms of their economic and social rights. What do you have to say about that aspect?
That is true for us. Anyway, the Sri Lankan people have gone through a very difficult time. So for them, it is basically there are two sides. One is the prices, the other side is the availability. So at the moment that the electricity and fuel that is available, but of course there are some challenges in the supply chains for some of the industries, some of the medicine and the healthcare sectors. There are some bottlenecks on that front. But in terms of prices, we all know the inflation went up to about 70% and more than that. So the price levels are still high. The challenge is the reforms for us, because the other side that the people have to bear the pressure is through taxation. Now already the taxes are have increased to a level, I think we cannot go beyond that. So then the other challenge would be, if we again go back on the same route that we were before, then the inflation will come up again, and then that hardship will also added on people's shoulders. So those things I think we have to keep in mind, and that's why the monetary stability plays a pivotal role in this reform process. Otherwise, of course, IMF or whoever can say that people should not, no more pressure should be added on people. But if the monetary system is not stable, it is natural, it's normal that it comes back to people. When the inflation hits like above 10%, regardless of whatever the measures, it is automatically coming down to people. And the challenge would be also, we are facing an election year next year. So generally what happens is, as we all know, during an election time there is an auctioning of non-existing resources, and that's how basically the central bank steals money from people through inflation. So that's what we have to avoid, to mainly minimize the pressure on people's point of view.
But surely the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, are actually monitoring the situation rather than just giving us, it's not a handout. So surely they're monitoring. What do you think they can do and can say, and how far can they influence the narrative?
So basically for us, they are having this carrot and stick approach. So basically, if you are not adhering to what we have agreed, most likely they will delay the next tranche, or they can only provide a portion of the second tranche. Of course, they are monitoring, or the process will be delayed. The challenge is, if we delay it, again it will affect on the overall economy, on confidence, and there will be a knockdown impact. But that's why we always push. It is IMF can bring some stability, but our game has to be on the growth, because if we only grow the economy, that people will feel some relief by increasing and improving their income levels. So that is where our focus should be, in my view.
What do you say to people who are saying that in the past, when the previous governments held on to to maintain the exchange rate at whatever it was, the pound was around the 200 mark and so on, and the dollar was much less. What do you say to people who say that now those people who wanted to float the exchange, the rate, and to have it market driven, and now of course it has resulted in the prices going up? How do you explain that away to people who are genuinely concerned about that?
Basically for us, there's this called triangle that we have to balance. Basically, if you want to keep your reserves at a certain level, you cannot control all three. You have reserves, you have interest rate, and you have exchange rate. What happens is, interest rate is simply the price that you have to pay to buy money. Basically, when you are borrowing money, interest rates is the price that you pay for it. So if the interest rates are low, you are automatically adding the pressure on dollars, because then when the interest rates are low means that you have easy access for money, so you are borrowing more money and you are importing. So that's why when the interest rates are coming down, your imports are also increasing, rather than it is not because of the removal of the import controls. Of course, it has an impact, but if you recall, when we have the strictest import controls, still our exchange rate dropped from 180 to 360. So one side is the exchange rate, so either you have to let it go, or else you have to pump the money from the reserves. Actually, central bank has been doing it to an extent which is not a good indication for the last 3 months. So on a net basis, on June, they have, I think, spent about 12 million US dollars, and I think 14 million in the next month. I think the last month they again spent about net wise about 170 million dollars to stabilize the dollar. But last month it will be also quite confusing, because there was also the domestic debt restructuring took place, and there was some exchange of some other bonds. So it is quite complicated for the last month, but what we can see is basically the central bank, to an extent, to try to keep the exchange rate by diluting their reserves or buying the dollars from the forex market. So if the more the central bank try to intervene, of course they have to let go one of the variables. Either they have to let go of the reserves, or either they have to let go of the interest rates. It's a very difficult balance to strike, but my view is that it is better to control to an extent with the interest rates, because I understand when the interest rates are high, people are finding it difficult to do businesses, borrow money and all that. But the challenge is Sri Lanka is a very small forex market. So just one or two players can have a significant impact on the market. So I would recommend not to dilute the reserves, neither to basically let go of the mainly have a lot of variations on the exchange rate as well, but to balance it off with the interest rate to an extent. But it doesn't mean that our interest rate has to be like 20%, 30%, where none of the businesses can exist.
At what rate what would you say would be the ideal rate for the interest rate?
Ideally for us, it should be determined by the market forces. So at the moment, as we know, the deposit rates have come down, but the lending rates is still high. So ideally it should come down if the markets are working well, but generally after a debt restructuring there is quite uncertainty in the market. So that's why they are reluctant to bring down the interest rates, but at the same time there is also banks are also trying to make quite a lot of profits by keeping the interest rates as high as well. But the general trend is after debt restructuring it should come down, but I expect the interest rates to be on single digit. But it all depends on what would be the reform process on one side, because if we can bring more tourism income and if we can bring more export income, then there is a chance that we can bring down the interest rates and as well as keep the exchange rate at a stable level. But ideally, straightforward answering your question, ideally it has to be somewhere between 10% to 12 to 15% is my range. Ideally it has to be the lesser the better, but it can be lesser the better, but you have to check on the other variables as well. So ideally you have to have a low interest rate, stable exchange rate, and somewhat solid reserves, which is adequate for about 12 months or 8 months is what is better. But we are in a very difficult spot that we cannot control all three variables. We have to let go one of it or keep a very strike a very difficult balance is our challenge.
And on that note, let's go for a quick break and take a peek at whatever awaits us in the future. In the meantime, we are in conversation with Mr. Dhananath Fernando. We'll be right back after the break.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali on TV1.
And welcome back to Newsline. I'm in conversation with Mr. Dhananath Fernando, the COO of the Advocata Institute, the award-winning one at that. Dhananath, thank you again for being on the program. So what next for Sri Lanka? What next?
What next is always reforms for us. Unfortunately, it's very slow. There are quite a few reforms that we have been always speaking about. One is the state-owned enterprises reforms. There's some progress, but nothing still has been basically converted as transactions or solid reforms. There's some progress that has been taken place in terms of conducting some of the financial feasibility studies and getting financial advisors on some of the transactions, but the window is narrowing down. So we have to move our feet quite faster. Otherwise, with the elections, we will be back on square one, and we will end up with the 18th IMF program. So that's number one. And also the trade reforms for us is quite important, because as we have been speaking, the economy has to grow, and a small economy can grow only through trade. Basically, we have to produce goods which adds value to the people's lives in other countries. So to do that, we should be able to produce and trade. And trade can only take place when we are competitive. We have to be competitive in price, competitive in quality, and delivery. So only through trade we can grow the economy, and the silver lining is India's economy is growing, so there is a chance that we can connect with the supply chains from India, but at the same time the global economic conditions are also quite uncertain. But I think the trade reforms and the state-owned enterprises reforms are a must. And the external debt restructuring is a must. I think what we have to focus is, rather than the IMF money, how faster we can move with these reforms. But having said that, not only the reforms, that the economic governance also need to take place, because without justice and without economic governance, none of these reforms will long last. So those were the factors that I would prioritize at this moment.
Okay, we hear this, but for the people of our country, what chances of the prices coming down? I mean, 62%, I'm sort of almost bored by saying this, but 62% of our working population are daily waged. And how is these poverty levels out in the rural areas, the economic challenges? What are the prospects of their lot getting slightly better?
So for us, unfortunately, I'll be very realistic and truthful, very unlikely the prices will come down, because inflation is the rate that the prices are increasing. So just because inflation number coming to like 2%, 3% doesn't mean the already increased prices would come down to the initial level of 2020 or 2019. Of course, some prices will come in few rupees, like I think the chicken prices have come down by 100 rupees. There are some indicators, but it doesn't mean it's come to the previous level. So the only option we have is to increase our income. But again, our income is low because of the inflation. I mean, we have an income, but of course we couldn't afford the same food basket that we could afford earlier. So as a result, we have to increase the income, and as I mentioned, the only way that when we can increase the income is by recovering the economy and connecting with global supply chains and doing trade. And when you do trade only, you can increase the income. So for people's point of view, I don't want to be creating artificial expectations. Prices will not come down. It is basically we have to go with the reforms and basically increase our income levels where we can bounce back or recover from the massive inflation spike that we went through. And already, as we know, the electricity prices have gone up, and so has water, and so many other utilities have a massive impact. So that the only way out is basically increasing our income levels.
So basically, the Sri Lankan people can only talk or express their displeasure and their frustration and their worries at the next election.
That is definitely yes. That's why the democracy should work, and the elections and the economic governance should also take place. Also, the challenge is, I think the humble request for people should be, and the people should look at on a more realistic point of view, because what happens is generally when an election comes, there's always this massive distribution takes place from taxpayer money which we couldn't afford, and as a result the central bank basically lending more money to the government, which ends up again back as a vicious cycle as inflation, which affects back the common people. So if someone promises this some non-existing resources, that won't work, because the government revenue is not even adequate to cover the expenditure. Basically most of the government revenue, about more than 70%, is just have to allocate for salaries and the pensions of the government sector, and then we need more revenue to just to pay the interest rate of the loans that we have already taken. So as a result, there is no way that government can have a very extended subsidy schemes or extended distribution program. There is no space in the fiscal front. So I would caution people, if with the election cycle, when you are deciding who should be the next set of leaders who will take the future forward, definitely the way forward is not announcing these relief packages, because it will cause more problems than bringing any solutions.
Well, it sounds, doesn't look very optimistic, does it, Dhananath?
It is. I would say that we have to keep the optimism in mind for us, because ultimately we all live on hopes, and we have to work harder with optimism to bring things back on track. But that's why I always push for reforms, because that's the only way out, and people should stand for the reforms, because otherwise it's their future, it's our future that we are ruining without economic reforms. And as we all know, these reforms are not rocket science, it's basics. So definitely these reforms needs to happen, and that's the only way that we can bring optimism. But we have to be optimistic to get the reforms done, and then we will see the results. But if we continue to do what we have been doing over the last few years, I do not see any progress in that front. So that's why we have to always look forward for reforms, and reforms is the only way out, and we have to grow out from the crisis to come out from this situation.
So Dhananath, what you're really saying is that unless there is a serious shift in policy and policy implementation, for example, we have a claim from a former customs officer that the revenue collected by customs is now 900 billion, but he says if the corruption was addressed, they could actually earn 1.8 trillion. Basically double the collection from the customs, but all sorts of corruption is going on, but that's a different story. What about collecting taxes? Are we operating optimally there, or are we not?
In terms of tax revenue for us, there are two sides. If we talk about the tariffs or the revenue from the customs which is collected at the border, one definite option is, I think, we have to simplify the tariff structure. At the moment it is very complicated, and that's why the corruption takes place. And if you have a simplified tariff structure, of course, as the gentleman has mentioned, I think we can double or triple the revenue from the customs, but not by increasing the tariff rate, but simplifying and bringing it down to a certain level. So then there is no incentive for people to bring it through the informal channel, because it's always easier to bring it through the formal channel when you know what is the applicable tariff rate. So that's why we have been always recommending, let's have like 3 or 4 bands, 0%, 5%, 10%, 15%. Let's remove all these PAL and cess and all that, which makes it's very complicated to anyone to calculate the tariff. That's on the customs front. When it comes to the income tax and the corporate tax, for us, we have to stick to the tax principles. That is mainly the taxes again has to be simple, it has to be transparent, it has to be stable, and it has to be neutral. So we have to, when we only stick to those tax principles, the tax revenue can be improved.
Right.
So those were my broad thoughts. That's the only way that we can improve the revenue. But of course, everyone has to pay their fair share as taxes. But we can improve that by only having a very stable and a transparent system.
And how are we doing in terms of the tax revenue between the time that the current president took over after the economic mess? How are we doing between that period and now?
Tax revenue has increased for us mainly by about more than about 90%, but we are still short from the target that we have agreed with the IMF. We are falling short by about 30-40% from what we have agreed, but the overall tax revenue has increased compared to last year. So that's the status of the taxes, and of course, as we all know, our tax to GDP ratio is quite low. But the way to increase the taxes is not just by pushing up the tax rates, because the more that we push up, take the tax rates up, people are also start evading the taxes. So that's why I always recommend have a stable, transparent, simple system. So then everyone, you can expand the tax base rather than trying to target on the same people who are paying taxes. At the same time, there are a lot of tax holidays have also been provided. That has to be also reversed, because tax holidays is also not recommended, because it's also leading with corruption, because the connected business people, the same connected corrupt circle gets the tax holidays, and at the same time they are also getting debt relief from the state banks. So that has also to be considered when we implement our tax policy.
It seems to me that we need a wholesale reorganization of our governance structure.
Absolutely, for us, we have to realign a lot of the bad practices that we have been doing. So definitely it's a reset. We have to reform and reset. Otherwise, by end of next year, after few years, again we will, as I mentioned, go back to the 18th IMF program. We have to go back to another debt restructuring program, and we will back at square one. So that's why it is important that we, rather than going from one crisis to another crisis, we have to reset and do the changes, because that's the only way forward. Any country who had come out from a crisis in this nature, it had only come out through reforms and basically resetting the bad things that we have been doing. And I don't see any other way out. I don't think actually there's any other way out available in the current context. It is the basics that we have to fix first.
It's all very depressing, Dhananath. But just because what impact will it be when the government of the day actually says, right, it's time to have the presidential elections and we're going to call it. How does that translate? Does the revenue suddenly start flowing into the treasury? What is it? What does it do, having this election?
No, elections of course will have many expenditure adding to the government, because as we know, our politicians really do not have the discipline to keep the fiscal side managed. But the elections are also important for us, because that's the way that people can decide or whether they are happy or unhappy with whoever who is ruling the country, and the democracy should prevail. Because if we do not stick to the elections, we have already delayed one election by a few months now, the local government elections, because we are not setting a good example by postponing elections. So definitely the elections needs to take place, in my view, because otherwise without a democracy, no investor, nobody will take Sri Lanka seriously. And so elections are quite important, because that's you have to get the people's mandate and buying for these reform program. But of course it is a somewhat costly exercise, but I think it is mandatory that we go with elections and making sure that the economy and the democracy prevails while the economic reforms taking place.
Well, thank you very much, Dhananath Fernando. Thank you for being on Newsline, and that's the way it was.